Imagine two exhausted heavyweight boxers. Right. They're in the 12th round of just this grueling, bloody fight.
Oh, yeah. Barely standing.
Exactly. Barely standing. And suddenly, they just grab onto each other in a clinch.
Right.
Now, that clinch isn't a sign of friendship, obviously. It's a desperate, instinctual need to avoid getting knocked out.
Yeah, they just need to catch their breath.
Right. And today, we are looking at a massive geopolitical clinch between the United States and the Iranian regime.
Specifically, an official memorandum of understanding, or MOU, that followed a period of really intense military conflict.
Yeah, a conflict that today's source material calls the March 9th War.
And what's fascinating here is that this clinch completely throws out the standard international relations playbook.
Oh, so?
Well, usually peace or a ceasefire happens when, one side wins or someone throws in the towel.
Right. A clear victor.
Exactly. But here we have two heavily entrenched adversaries agreeing to a sudden breather, even though neither side achieved their stated geopolitical goals.
It makes no sense on paper. So welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to unpack a really complex and highly charged piece of source material.
Yes, we're looking at a broadcast interview from a program called Radio Irava, featuring an analyst named Mr. Behrouz Partovi.
Right, and he is breaking down the hidden mechanics, the domestic pressures, and all the unstated motives behind this recent U.S.-Iran MO.
But before we really get into the weeds of his analysis, we need to establish some crucial context for you, the listener.
Yeah, mandatory disclaimer time. This is important.
It is. The source material we are unpacking today contains heavily polarized, politically charged viewpoints.
Yeah, much so.
Yeah, specifically regarding the Iranian regime, the U.S. administration, and the Iranian opposition movement.
Exactly. And we want to be crystal clear right up front. We are taking absolutely no sides here.
Zero.
Right. Our goal isn't to endorse, validate, or, condemn the political stances presented in the broadcast.
We're merely here to explore, analyze, and map out the claims, the perspectives, and arguments, exactly as Mr. Partovi presents them.
Everything we discuss today is viewed strictly through the lens of his analysis.
Because regardless of your own political leanings, the mechanics of how he views these negotiations offer a deeply insightful window into Middle Eastern diplomacy.
It really does. It highlights how foreign policy is, almost always driven by domestic survival.
Always.
Okay, let's unpack this. Why would two nations, deep in the middle of an escalating conflict, suddenly pump the brakes?
Well, according to Partovi's analysis, this MOU was born entirely out of mutual exhaustion. Both boxers needed the clinch.
Okay, so let's start with the regime side of the equation.
Right. He describes an economy that isn't just in a recession, but is fundamentally collapsing under the weight of this mobilization.
Yeah, the economic picture he paints is just dire.
Oh, it's incredibly bleak. Partovi cites reports, and he notes these are reports even from state-run media linked to the regime's own military apparatus.
Wow, really? So they're admitting it themselves?
Yeah, admitting that inflation on 12 basic food items has hit triple digits.
Triple digits. Just on food.
Exactly. We're talking about inflation over 100% during this specific conflict window.
Let's think about the mechanism behind that for a second. Why does a foreign conflict specifically spike the cost of basic food?
It's a supply chain issue at its core.
Right, because when a state funnels all of its capital, its logistics, and its supply chains into a military mobilization, the civilian infrastructure just collapses.
Yep. If the ports and the currency are being used to move missile parts or, fund militias.
You aren't importing wheat. You aren't importing fertilizer. The supply of everyday goods just evaporates.
Exactly. And that economic evaporation is an immediate trigger for domestic unrest.
Starvation leads to revolution, usually.
Right. But here is the profound paradox that Partovi highlights. This foreign conflict, as economically devastating as it was, ironically served the regime's domestic agenda perfectly.
Wait, how so?
Because under the cover of this foreign war, the regime had the ultimate pretext for martial law.
Oh, I see. A national security crisis.
Yes. Partovi argues that the war allowed them to heavily militarize the streets and dramatically increase executions.
Especially political prisoners, right?
Exactly, all under the guise of national security. They essentially used the foreign conflict to violently suppress domestic uprisings that were already brewing.
So the foreign war was actually like a domestic policing strategy.
Precisely. But you can only play that card for so long before the economic reality catches up with you.
Right. People still need to eat.
Yeah, and the argument here is that the regime was approaching a violent tipping point. They were terrified of a massive, uncontrollable general uprising if this extreme economic pressure continued.
So they faced the very real threat of being overthrown not by American bombs, but by their own starving population.
Exactly. They needed the MOU to survive economically.
Okay, and what about the U.S. side? Because the U.S. administration obviously wasn't facing a domestic revolution or, food shortages.
No, but they are facing the relentless pressure of the political calendar.
The elections.
Right. Partovi points out that the U.S. president is heavily constrained by the upcoming November midterms.
Makes sense. The administration simply cannot afford to get bogged down in a prolonged war of attrition in the Middle East.
Not while trying to protect a fragile congressional majority at home, no.
Plus, the analysis notes that the U.S. is scrutinizing every dollar 4 or 5 times right now.
Because funding a long-term asymmetric conflict is astronomically expensive.
And politically toxic right before an election. So both sides are exhausted for entirely different reasons, and they agree to the clinch.
Right, they draft this memorandum of understanding.
But here is where it gets bizarre.
Yeah.
If both sides desperately needed this pause just to survive their own domestic pressures, how did they sell it to their respective audiences?
This is where it gets really interesting.
Because if you look at the regime's domestic PR campaign, they didn't just tell their citizens they survived the round, they claimed they knocked the U.S. out cold.
This is where we see a massive disconnect between propaganda and reality.
Total disconnect.
Partovi draws a stark contrast between what the regime told its citizens and the actual on-the-ground terms of the MOU.
According to his breakdown, regime media went into absolute overdrive, right?
Oh, yeah. They claimed a humiliating victory over the U.S.
They broadcasted that $12 billion was being released to them.
And that they had secured the right to charge maritime tolls in the Strait of Hormuz.
And that nuclear inspectors were completely banned from critical sites.
Right. Which, as you can imagine, is a deliberate strategy to pacify a population dealing with that triple-digit inflation.
It's state-mandated theater. But Partovi notes that this aggressive PR campaign caused serious blowback in the U.S., didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Political figures like J.D. Vance and Donald Trump publicly called the regime's leadership dishonorable liars because of these broadcasts.
Because the actual negotiated terms of the MOU paint a completely different picture.
A vastly different picture. Let's break down the reality of those claims, starting with the Strait of Hormuz.
Okay, so the regime claimed they were going to start charging tolls to international shipping.
Right. But Partovi quickly points out a fundamental reality. The Strait of Hormuz is a natural waterway.
Yeah, you can't just set up a toll booth on the ocean.
Exactly. It's not the Suez Canal.
Right. The Suez is a man-made trench. It costs money to dig. It costs money to maintain, so tolls make legal and economic sense. Hormuz is just geography.
And the legal reality is even more restrictive. Oman, who shares control of the strait, flatly rejected the toll plan as entirely illegal.
So what's the actual on-the-ground reality?
According to the source, commercial ships are simply navigating through Omani territorial waters to avoid the regime.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they're being heavily protected by the U.S. military's Central Command, or CENTCOM.
So the strait remains open, and the regime collects 0 tolls.
0.
Okay, so the maritime toll is a myth. What about the massive cash injection? The regime claimed they were getting $12 billion in unfrozen assets.
Well, Partovi states it is actually $6 billion, and it's sitting in Qatari banks.
Wait, 6, not 12. And it's not even in their hands.
Right. And here is the crucial mechanism of how that money works. It is strictly not released as cash.
How does it work then?
The terms dictate an escrow-style arrangement where this money is earmarked solely for agricultural products.
Like what?
Specifically corn, wheat, and animal feed. And the ultimate kicker.
What?
The MOU requires that this money be used to buy these products exclusively from American farmers.
Okay, I have to push back on the logic here.
Go for it.
If the terms are genuinely this humiliatingly restrictive for the regime, essentially dictating that they take their own frozen funds, leave them in a foreign bank, and hand the money directly to U.S. agricultural sectors to buy wheat,
Yeah.
why on earth would they sign it? And more importantly, why would they risk bragging about a fake victory on state TV when the reality is so easily disproven?
That is the pivotal question. And it brings us to the third crucial term of the MOU, the nuclear inspections.
Because the regime claimed they kicked the inspectors out.
Right. But Partovi states the exact opposite is happening. The UN's nuclear watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, is scheduled to return to Iran.
Oh, wow.
And they aren't just doing routine checks. They are specifically tasked with assessing sites that were bombed by US B-2s, places like Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan.
Wait, to do what?
To locate 440 kilograms of highly sensitive, 60% enriched uranium.
So they surrendered on the maritime tolls, they surrendered control of their own funds, and they opened their bomb nuclear sites to the IAEA.
Yes.
I'll ask again, why sign a deal that reads like a total capitulation?
Because, as Partovi's analysis suggests, they aren't trying to buy policy wins or resources.
Then what are they buying?
Time. They are buying the most valuable commodity in geopolitics, time.
So they're essentially trying to run out the clock. Let me guess. They're looking at the U.S. political calendar and banking on the November midterms to change the landscape.
Exactly. The argument here is that the regime is hoping the current U.S. administration loses its congressional majority.
Which would completely paralyze U.S. foreign policy leverage.
Right. They are also waiting on Israeli elections. They are surviving day by day, hoping the international landscape shifts in their favor.
But there's a much more urgent reason they need time, isn't there?
Oh, yes. And it has nothing to do with Washington or Tel Aviv.
Right. This brings us back to what's happening inside Iran's borders. Partovi spends a significant amount of the interview detailing this internal pressure.
Yes. And this is arguably the core thesis of his entire breakdown.
Okay, let's get into it.
He details a massive internal threat that materialized right before the recent military escalation.
When exactly?
In late February, specifically Esfand 4th through the 8th on the Persian calendar, massive, highly coordinated protests erupted.
And this wasn't just peaceful marching, right?
Not at all. Partovi notes that a 250-person armed unit of the National Liberation Army, which is associated with the primary Iranian opposition group, the MEK, directly attacked the Supreme Leader's headquarters.
A 250-person unit attacking the absolute center of power. That isn't a riot.
No, it's not.
That is a coordinated military operation against the state's command structure.
And it was followed by massive organized protests by university students, high schoolers, farmers, and pensioners across the entire country.
Wow.
Partovi paints a picture of a nation on the absolute brink of a democratic revolution. The state's control was fracturing.
And this leads to that really dark conclusion about the shield of war.
Yes. Exactly.
By analyzing Partovi's logic, we can deduce that the regime actually prefers being bombed by foreign adversaries over dealing with their own unarmed citizens protesting in the streets.
That is precisely what he is arguing. The foreign war acts as an ironclad shield for the regime against its own people.
Because when B-2 bombers are in the sky, martial law is justified.
Right. People can't safely gather in town squares to protest. Universities, which are hotbeds for dissent, get shut down.
So the foreign conflict effectively paused the domestic revolution just as it was reaching a boiling point.
Exactly, which means a genuine lasting peace is actually their worst-case scenario.
Right. If the war stops, the shield is lifted, and they have to face the domestic uprising again.
Exactly. And Partovi points out that there is a deep ideological fracture within the regime over this exact dynamic.
Who is fracturing?
Well, he specifically mentions factions like the Endurance Front.
Who are they?
These are radical hardliners whose entire political identity and grip on power rely on continuous conflict.
So for them, signing a peace deal isn't just a political compromise.
No, it's an ideological death sentence. They are terrified that any move will immediately reignite the real war with the Iranian populace.
Because if there's no foreign enemy to fight, they actually have to govern.
And they are comprehensively failing to do that.
That is incredibly grim.
Yeah.
The idea that a ruling class needs a foreign military dropping bombs on its own infrastructure just to keep its citizens trapped in their home?
It's dark, yeah.
It really leads to a highly cynical view of global geopolitics. Because if the regime's primary war is against its own people, you naturally have to ask, where do human rights or the push for a democratic society actually fit into this U.S.-Iran MO?
According to Partovi's blunt assessment, they don't.
Not at all.
Human rights are completely and entirely absent from this agreement. He argues that no foreign nation in history spends billions of dollars on a military campaign just to secure human rights for another country's citizens.
Geopolitics is driven by interests, not altruism.
Exactly.
He quotes Henry Kissinger here, which I think is the perfect distillation of that cynical view. If you want to control the Middle East, you must control Iran.
Yes. Partovi uses that quote to explain why the global community, despite all its rhetoric, might actually fear a democratic Iran.
Wait, why would they fear it?
We have to look at the resources at play. Iran holds the world's fourth largest oil reserves and the second largest gas reserves.
Oh, wow. Combined, that is the largest single energy reservoir on the planet.
Right. And his argument is that Western powers, deep down, vastly prefer the predictable, manageable geopolitical status quo over the uncertainty of a revolution.
It makes me think of the Middle East as this massive, incredibly precarious Jenga tower.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, like the global energy market, shipping lanes, regional alliances, it's all built into this towering, unstable structure.
And the foreign powers look at the regime in Iran, and they see a corrupt, brutal bloc in that tower, sure.
But it's a predictable bloc.
Exactly. They'd rather deal with the devil they know than risk a sudden, sweeping democratic shift.
Because that shift might pull the wrong piece and topple the entire global economic structure.
That Jenga analogy perfectly captures Partovi's argument regarding Western reluctance. The world relies on the current structure, however flawed and violent it is.
But Partovi doesn't just leave it there, does he?
No, he presents an alternative to this binary choice of either appeasing a brutal regime or fighting endless foreign wars against them.
Right. He introduces what the Iranian resistance calls the third way.
The third way.
Neither foreign war, which, as we discussed, just gives the regime an excuse to crack down, nor diplomatic appeasement.
Right. The third way, as described in the broadcast, is a call for the international community to simply stand aside.
Just step back.
Yeah. Stop making financial deals with the regime, stop trying to manage the Jenga tower, and allow the Iranian people the space to overthrow the government themselves.
And to prove that this isn't just, wishful thinking, Partovi points to a massive rally held by the opposition on June 20th in Paris.
And the logistics of that rally are really what caught my eye in his analysis.
Same here. He mentions that 836 buses full of supporters arrived from all over Europe and North America.
To demand a democratic republic.
Yes, and we need to understand the logistical implications of that. Organizing 836 buses, moving tens of thousands of people across international borders, coordinating housing and security.
All despite local police initially trying to ban the gathering.
Exactly. That requires massive logistical infrastructure. Partovi is highlighting this to show the international community that the opposition isn't some fractured fringe group.
Right. They're trying to signal to the world that if that Jenga block gets pulled, there isn't going to be a vacuum of chaos.
They are demonstrating state-level organizational capacity. They are a government in waiting, ready to manage the country.
Exactly. They are trying to alleviate that Kissinger-esque fear of the unknown.
But, of course, the regime isn't going to just step aside politely.
Obviously not.
Which brings us to the ultimate fate of this MOU. Given the fundamental mismatch between what the MOU demands on paper and what the regime needs to survive domestically, what happens next?
This is where his analysis predicts a total collapse of the agreement.
Just doomed from the start.
Doomed from the start. It's built on sand.
Why?
Because he argues the regime simply cannot abandon what he calls its three pillars of survival.
Which are?
Its nuclear capabilities, its ballistic missile programs, and its network of regional proxy forces.
And he provides a very recent tangible example to prove just how inherently unstable this arrangement is, right?
Yeah, he does. Immediately after, a separate three-way diplomatic deal was reached between the U.S., Israel, and Lebanon to stabilize that specific border.
The Iranian regime allegedly launched an attack on a commercial cargo ship.
Yep.
And why do that right after a stabilizing deal?
To protect Hezbollah, their proxy force in Lebanon, and ensure the region stays destabilized.
Wow. And that cargo ship attack resulted in swift, massive retaliation, didn't it?
It did. The U.S. military bombed coastal bases belonging to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC.
Destroying critical regime infrastructure.
Yes.
But wait, let's trace the logic here. If their reliance on proxy forces and missile strikes is consistently provoking massive retaliation that destroys their own military bases,
yeah,
isn't their deterrence strategy completely backfiring on them? I mean, why keep poking the bear if it costs you your own naval infrastructure?
It seems completely illogical from a standard military perspective.
Right.
But if we connect this back to the shield of war concept Partovi outlined earlier, it makes a twisted kind of sense.
It's a feature, not a bug.
Exactly. The regime needs the crisis. They actively invite the retaliation.
Because they need the bear to roar to keep the people inside the house terrified.
That's a great way to put it. Partovi argues that as long as this regime exists, it requires foreign enemies and perpetual crises to justify its domestic failures.
and to maintain its violent grip on an increasingly organized, angry populace.
Right. Sacrificing a few IRGC naval bases is a price they are perfectly willing to pay if it means keeping the country in a state of martial law and emergency.
So, to synthesize all of these incredibly complex threads, well, not ... but you know what I mean. If we look through the lens of Mr. Partovi's analysis, this MOU is not a genuine peace treaty.
It is certainly not a victory for either side.
Right. It is a temporary, highly fragile pause in a much larger multi-front war.
And the most critical front of that war isn't happening in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz.
And it isn't happening in the halls of Washington, D.C.
No, the true battleground is the internal existential struggle happening right now between the regime and its own citizens.
That is the essential takeaway from this broadcast. This deep dive into the source material serves as a really stark lesson in how to read between the lines of international diplomacy.
Absolutely. Treaties, memorandums, and ceasefires aren't always about resolving a conflict.
Sometimes they are purely about managing domestic political calendars, securing short-term economic survival, and keeping your opponent in a clinch just long enough to catch your breath for the next round.
It really reframes how you look at the news cycle.
It does. The next time you see two adversaries shaking hands or signing a document at a summit, you have to ask yourself, who is this piece actually designed for?
And who is it secretly hurting?
Exactly. It's all about looking past the PR and examining the mechanics of survival.
Right.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to ponder. This builds on what we've unpacked today, but pushes the geopolitical implications a step further.
Okay, let's hear it.
We discussed Partovi's argument that foreign powers secretly fear a democratic Iran because it would disrupt the global energy markets and the established Middle East status quo.
The Jenga tower.
Right, the Jenga tower.
Yeah.
But consider this. If a nation holding the world's combined largest reserves of oil and gas suddenly transitioned into a transparent, functioning democracy, how would the global economy radically restructure itself overnight?
To adapt to that new, transparent flow of energy.
Yes. Rather than causing a catastrophic collapse of that geopolitical Jenga tower, could that deeply feared disruption actually be the catalyst for an entirely new era of global economic innovation and stability?
That's a fascinating question.
It is something to think about the next time you see global gas prices fluctuate or watch a diplomatic summit on the evening news. Thanks for joining us on this night dive.